Okay, good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the territory in which we are finding ourselves today. And as we do have international guests, we always extend the invitation for you to acknowledge where you are as well. So the Victoria Arts Council and Creative Mornings is coming to you live from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen speaking people, which encompass the Songhees, the Wasanich, and the Esquimalt nations. And we recognize the honor of doing our work here on these traditional territories, and mainly because of the ongoing legacy of colonialism. And we cannot adjust and address colonialism until we name it. And so this is the small part that we can do in that larger fight. My name is Kagan McFadden, and I am the Executive Director of the Victoria Arts Council, as well as the co-lead with Leah McInnes of Creative Mornings Victoria. And very excited to be welcoming you all today to this special monthly lecture series. Now Leah McInnes will take it over. Thank you.
Thank you, Kagan. So before we get started, I do have a couple of slides that I want to go through to thank our sponsors. Just bear with me as my screen loads. So as Kagan mentioned, my name is Leah McInnes. I'm the outreach coordinator at the Victoria Arts Council, and then also co-lead of the Victoria chapter of Creative Mornings. So welcome to Creative Mornings. August's theme is release. Release is a critical part of growth, healing, and transformation. We can release each other from our claims. We can be the means of each other's deliverance. It's what gives the words, "I release you," their power. Creative Mornings Portsmouth chose August's theme of release, and Ali Runyon illustrated the theme. We want to say thank you to MailChimp, Creative Mornings' official global partner for marketing. They are promoting an insider community called MailChimp & Co. It's a freelancer, it's an agency for freelancers to help connect marketing and communication. Joining will allow you to access insider benefits like exclusive tips and training. So you can head over there at mailchimp.com/and-co. We also want to thank Skillshare, our newest global partner for online learning. Skillshare is an online learning community helping millions take the next step on their creative journey. This month, we want you to check out this ultimate self-care playbook that's put together by Jonathan Van Ness. You can take the class for free or with a 1-week free trial of Skillshare at skillshare.com. We also want to thank HCMA, our local partner. HCMA is an architecture firm that designs buildings, brands, and shared experiences that connect people. And also thank you to the City of Victoria. If you are locally in Victoria, we would love to have you come down to our gallery, the Victoria Arts Council, and check out the current exhibition and Inheritance. Okay, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Neel. I have a bit of a bio to introduce her before I pass it over. So Luann is from the Mama Lila Kula and Kwagolth people of the Kwakwak, the Kwakwala speaking people. Luann was born in Alberta Bay, BC, but has lived much of her life in Victoria in the unceded traditional territories of the Lekwungen people. Luann is a practicing visual artist working in textiles, jewelry, illustration, painting, and digital design. Luann has been an active volunteer in the Indigenous arts community for the past 40 years, specializing in copyright and intellectual property rights of Indigenous artists, their families, communities, and nations. Luann joined the Royal BC Museum in April 2018 as the repatriation specialist. She works with the Royal BC Museum as Curator of Indigenous Collections and the Assistant Head of Indigenous Collections and Repatriation Department. We're so honored to have Luann with us. So I'm going to pass it over to her now. Thank you.
Ela Kasla. Ela Kastakla. Eat cat web batrin. Gayu Chinlacha Mamalilakla to Aquagils. La and Hakela Kasla Hat La Punkin. La Hiskela Gachens, Hans Gachela Hoch, a wheatnut wisas. And what I've just said in my language of Kwakwala is a welcome to everyone here. Just sharing one of the names that I carry in my family, which is Ikyatwega, and also explaining that I'm from the Mamalilakla and the Kwagyuth. You did a good job on those pronunciations. Yeah, I've had several roles at the Royal BC Museum recently. My heart and my passion is as that of an artist, but I also spent a few years in government fairly early on in my career, and took a shining and likings for some reason to policy, and ended up becoming a policy expert about 30 years ago, and continued to work. So I feel like I'm always using my left brain and my right brain. My roles, I have, as mentioned, I started off as the repatriation specialist at the Royal BC Museum, and then I moved on to become the successful candidate for the curator role just over a year ago, about a year and a week ago. But I had to take over as the acting head of the Indigenous Collections and Repatriation Department when my boss stepped away for a bit. So I'll be in that role as the acting head for probably another couple of months. And then I'm really looking forward to landing back in my role as curator, because I only got to be curator for 4 days, which means I didn't get anything started. What I wanted to share today, and I'm really thankful to the council for inviting me to share today, because I think it's really important that we talk about the context of release and the idea of repatriation in the same breath, because I think that one of the things when I look at this, the idea of repatriation as an artist, one of the first things I started to say at the museum was, these are not artifacts that you have in the collection, it's art. And they're artistic objects that may have been used as everyday items, and some of them were very specifically for ceremonial purposes, and some were for really sacred uses, not to be seen in the public or to be shared publicly. And so it's been a really busy 3.5 years, just getting that mindset changed and getting people to use different language and to think about museum collections quite differently. One of the things that's really important that I hold dear to my heart is making sure that our young people get an opportunity to learn all of the traditions of our artistic histories, and to pick that up and continue practicing those traditions and bring them back into modern use and everyday use. We consider our culture a living culture. And so it's odd, it's really strange and sometimes really disturbing to see some of our precious treasures stored behind glass in museum cases for people to gaze upon. And so part of the work that I've been doing it's very broad, but one of my favorite parts is working with local artists and also artists from the different nations throughout BC. So it's really, I think, important to share that in British Columbia, or the lands that we call British Columbia right now, there are actually more than 35 completely different languages, First Nations languages. There always have been. It's as diverse as as Europe. Yeah, the one language does not translate to the other, and we often, in the old days, or prior to the contact with Europeans, people were simply multilingual. They didn't have one common language. Chinook became a language that was further developed when visitors landed here. But prior to that, we actually had multicultural languages, and so that was common practice. And one of our grandmothers, who actually used to tell stories at the museum back in the 70s, she spoke at least 5 languages, I believe. So it's important to note that, because with 35 different languages means you have 35 different cultures, which means you have 35 different histories. And within each language group, of course, there are dialect differences depending on the geographical region where people are situated. And so many of the things that we, as First Nations people, use to describe our histories, our origin stories, all of those things are manifested in the artworks. And so the artworks aren't things that we used to create just to decorate our houses. They were very much a part of our everyday life, and were actually connected to a name, a place, a person, and a ceremony. So when people say, especially on the topic of appropriation, which is also one thing I talk a lot about in my practice, it's not simply a matter of copying, say, a design like I did this cape for my grad from art school. And if someone were to take that and copy it and put it on t-shirts or whatever, they would not only be appropriating my artwork, they'd actually be stealing from my family, because these are my family crests. They belong to me. I inherited them. So it's really important, I think, that we spend a lot more time in Canada and really around the world, and with countries that are connected through the Berne Convention, and talk about the way to handle copyright now and understand it differently. So I'll just go back to the idea of repatriation and release was what I really wanted to talk about this morning. Part of the work that we're doing is with artists. If we've had artists coming in to the museum or pre-COVID to spend some time in the collections and take a look at things that can be replicated and brought back to the communities. Repatriation, when I first started, seemed like this very straightforward two-way street. There was an object, it would be returned to the community, and then the community would be able to have it back, to bring it back to life in their ceremonies. But what I found out very quickly after beginning to talk with communities was that having an object back meant nothing if the photographs and the audio, any film, video, any documents in the museum associated with that object would have to be returned as well. So the museum is going through a really big process of learning how to release these things, because it doesn't belong to the museum. Maybe legally, in the Western sense, it's understood to belong legally to the museum because it's in the possession of the museum, but really it belongs back in the community. So what we have at the museum is, right now we're actually beginning to do a full inventory of the Indigenous collections, and there's about 15,000 plus objects, or what we call cultural treasures. There's over 65,000, probably more like 100,000 photos. There are about 3,500 audio recordings, that some of them are linguistic recordings that elders came in back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and recorded for the purpose of sharing back with their communities. Some of them are recordings of actual ceremonies that linguists and curators were invited to attend some of our ceremonies. And so they recorded for our elders, and then all the documents that are associated. So returning, getting all of these things ready to return to the community, the first fear that I encountered from especially members of the museum and patrons of the museum was this concern that if the museum began repatriating and letting everything go, it would be an empty space. Well, that of course didn't happen. And one of the discussions, the most frequent discussion I had with the communities who were asking about repatriating their cultural treasures was, many of them said, right at this moment, we don't have a space to safely store them if they were to come home. If they were brought home tomorrow, we wouldn't have a safe space. And this is just some of the communities. Other communities do have cultural centers and cultural education centers, so they're definitely ready to receive their treasures back. But for the communities who said that they didn't have a space, they wanted to engage in a discussion about clarifying ownership of items, because if we're talking about legally and the legal aspect of it first, they wanted that in writing. One of the elders that came in very early on, a couple of years ago, who I've known for many, many years, he said, you remember me, Luann. He said, when I started in this business, I was a young fella. And now look at me, I'm an elder. And I don't want my grandchildren to have to fight the same fight. I don't want them to have to show up at the front door of this place and engage in this entire discussion all over again. So I want it in writing. As long as you're in this job, I want you to arrange for us to get clarification in writing that these items do indeed belong to us. Have that with each of our treasurers. And so if you move on and somebody else takes your spot, there's no question about it. We don't have to do this again. And I thought that was really wise of him to share that. And I added it to my actual step-by-step process for repatriation. Some of the other things that the artists and I have been talking about is this idea of, because there's a couple ways we can release the pieces and get them back to their communities. One of them is to create replicas that go back into the community, because some of the pieces are now so fragile. They were very old pieces when they were brought to the museum, and they can't be danced again, or they probably shouldn't be danced again. They'd be in jeopardy of being damaged. So artists have talked about creating replicas so that they can replace the old piece, but also because the old pieces oftentimes have a name and are already associated with somebody, they basically do a ceremony that lifts that name and all of its history from the old piece and places it on the new piece. And this is done very publicly in our ceremonies so that everyone can acknowledge, we know now, and you have 500 witnesses that will say, yes, I saw that mask being transferred to the grandson of the original owner of the mask. So there's that possibility. And the other one, which we've seen in some museums, is where artists are creating replicas and they exchange the replica for the original. So that's also possible. And then finally, the last piece we're looking at is the idea, and this is just part of the process, is taking pieces, placing them legally on long-term loans, and until we are finished with the negotiations for their return. This isn't a negotiation where there's a potential the community won't get it back. The negotiation is more about the timeline, what works for the community, and how they want to do it. They let us know, they let me know, and me and my team follow their direction. And so it's a really different way of handling repatriation than has been done in the past. And I think a large part of that is due to the fact that we have many more Indigenous staff now in the museum. And so people coming from different First Nations backgrounds, including Métis, and letting us know their teachings and what their grandmothers and grandfathers taught them is really enriched the way we think about and the way we map out our own practice. I'm going to stop there because there's, I could go on for days, but I'd love to know if anyone has questions about any of that. And I see one in the chat, especially if someone explaining how it is used culturally. It's not only the element, it's the history of these. Yes, I really, we're really getting to a new place, I think, around talking about how pieces that are in museums would ordinarily or typically have been used. And this is great timing because I was just up in my hometown of Alert Bay the last few days and got to talk with my auntie, one of my auntie who's been very involved in the culture since she was a young girl. And she reminded me, she says, this really important work that you're doing at that museum, and we hope you stay there and continue this work. But also keep in mind that our ceremonies and the way we do things in our practices that we only do amongst our people and for ourselves, that's a form of cultural appropriation if you keep sharing it out. So you don't have to explain everything. The concern she had is because in her lifetime, she's also seen and been really affected and concerned about people taking different practices from our cultures and using it incorrectly and out of context. We heard years ago about the folks who did sweat lodges for a fee, non-native people who did sweat lodges for a fee, and people died in those sweat lodges, those sweat lodges. So you have to be really knowledgeable. It's not just knowledgeable about how to construct something and how to go through the motions of it. It's connected to our spirituality practices. We regard our spirituality as that, not religion, not organized religion, it's spirituality. And all of that is interwoven in our culture. So I was really glad my auntie explained that. There are parts that we're always willing to share and educate people. My great uncle was Mungo Martin, who is world renowned for the work he's done to educate the public about our histories and our art. And he very much was a champion, along with my grandmother, for all of that work. Sorry, okay. Are you waving at me? Your audio's off?
Somebody just came to the door, and so I just waved them away.
Oh, I thought you were waving at me to stop now. My time was up.
No, I'm so sorry, Luann. I think Kagan.
I wanted to clarify something, Luann. Thank you so much for the introduction to what I know as years and decades of research and hard work and emotional labor. So when you were talking about certain cultural artifacts and other artworks being reproduced because of the fear that the original was too fragile, I just wanted to clarify what happens to that original artwork after the aura, for want of a better word, but after the ceremony of transferring, its history from the old to the new host.
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah, it's the wooden mask or a garment or something, and it's so fragile. Is it then? I think you said it was maybe sometimes given to the ancestors, like the grandson or whoever might want it.
The new work would be inherited by or placed on the grandchild, but the original really fragile piece, this is the negotiation part, is if communities wanted to stay with the museum because it's in a safe place. The conservation department can make sure that it's kept safe. People from the family can still come and visit and study and research and just spend time with the piece. So it's changing the relationship of how the communities, the original communities who created these pieces, engage with these works. And a lot of what we'll be doing starting next month, in a few weeks actually, we'll be carrying out a community engagement process that's probably going to take at least 2 years, possibly 4. And we're going to be talking with communities to ask them, first of all, here's how we in the museum world normally handle things and wrap things and store them. Are we doing it correctly, or should we be doing something differently? So we're getting advice from the communities themselves. And some of this has already happened over the years. So that's been really good. So we're just expanding that idea. And then also, just are there items, tell us which items should not be seen. If not everybody knows that. So we want to hear directly from, any one of those 35 communities that are represented in this collection, to make sure that we're not putting things out for display that shouldn't be seen by the public at all. I feel that what is not told is lost. Objects, languages, culture. I have no children. And if I have, I wonder how I could explain some photos from my family that I cannot myself imagine. Who is that? So for the objects, cultures are so important, especially when it's shared, human richness. Yeah, and I think that there's a great deal of wisdom. This is the other thing that is so multifaceted about the artwork that comes from First Nations in BC is, well, in anywhere, but I'm talking mainly about BC because I work with the provincial museum, is that those histories are also great wisdom about the land, about the waters, about the way we take care of the territories and make sure that it's there for 7 generations to come. And so this idea that a mask, for instance, let's say we have a Thunderbird mask, and this, the thing on my cape is a young Thunderbird. So let's say there was a Thunderbird carved mask out of wood, and it wouldn't just be something that a person would wear on their head and use to dance. It signifies by its design, sometimes its color, sometimes its embellishments with the headdress. Helps to locate that particular mask to a specific geographic location. And when you talk about that Thunderbird in relation to that geographic location, you know that or what we would know amongst our culture is that the people of that family or the extended family are responsible for that river that's next to that piece of land, that mountain, those harvesting grounds, and all of the animals that you hunt. So that's what I mean. It's so interconnected, and the names that would be associated with that mask would also very much tell about a very specific geographic location and the responsibilities. So names in our culture have roles, obligations, responsibilities, and duties, but you don't get to reap the benefits or exercise any prerogatives or rights until you fulfill your roles, duties, responsibilities, and obligations. So there's a real balance there. This is another thing about our language which is now slowly starting to get appropriated by people outside of our culture as well, is, can you tell me the name for such and such? I want to name my company from using your language. And it's not that easy, not that straightforward either. So I'll pause again. Any other questions here? I heard also of a wild place with water that was emptied after some work underground. It's important to respect the land and the indigenous. I read one of my first books in my life at school that I recommend, Spoiled by the Sun. Nourished by culture. Oh, thank you, Olivier. Yeah, there's the respect for the land is huge, well, obviously, because you have to continue living on that land, and you have to make sure that it's going to be a safe environment for your children and your grandchildren. And right now in Canada, because of colonialism and because of the very specific agenda of colonizing this country and other indigenous peoples around the world, our people were forced onto what is called lands reserved for Indians. And legally, that's what it's called, but people say reserves for short, or in the US, they call them reservations. But what they are is little postage stamp size chunks of land where our people were forced, usually not productive lands. So it wasn't intended that our people were going to survive. There was either get assimilated or die. And so we're still dealing with the ripple of that, because of course our populations have bounced back after many diseases, tuberculosis, smallpox epidemics in the 1800s and onward. So now we have growing communities and still this one little parcel of land. So we're dealing with that. At the same time, we're watching people pillage our forests and destroy our salmon streams and all of our waterways. Big corporations from other countries, big corporations from Canada. So sometimes I get political as an artist. I have a lot to say about that. I think it's my duty when I introduced myself at the beginning. Ikelweka is one of my names, and I have 5 names, and each one of them speaks to my responsibility. And for me, I bring that together and I put that into my art practice and also into my daily work at the museum. I feel like I've been given these opportunities in my lifetime so that I could help make things right. And so I don't get to do it all alone, thank goodness. I have really good elders supporting me, people in community, people who are very knowledgeable in my same age group, who were really brought up in our culture and help me to characterize the things that I need to say and the work I need to do. So it's a very big line of work, and but very important, and I sure appreciate getting to do this. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. I thank you once again. I'll probably just keep saying thank you, but I was wondering if if you could speak about policy around work going the other way, like contemporary Indigenous art, like acquisitions, or what those conversations are looking like in museums today.
That's a great question, and very timely also, because we actually just got our collections and research strategy started recently, just renewing that whole idea. One of the big things we're going to have to really work on is work more closely with our foundation and with our donors and supporters, because acquisitions in past have always been sort of under the umbrella of a curator or anthropologist or somebody in these different scientific fields. But now what we're looking at is, you know, this exchange idea and who's funding that, and also something that is really uncomfortable for a lot of museums to talk about, and that is the how they managed to get these pieces in the first place, and the questions from First Nations communities about the legitimacy about the sale of pieces or purchase of pieces. Were they in fact purchased, and or were they taken? And if they were purchased, were they purchased under duress? This is actually talked about in the repatriation policy of the museum. And we have an Indigenous advisory and advocacy committee that, and so I worked closely with them on writing the repatriation policy for the museum. And it's actually undergoing a little bit of a review this fall. So that'll start in about a month, mostly because the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was a game changer. It really helped us to change the language we use now in the current policy. We can be a great deal more certain. And in British Columbia, there was the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. And that piece of legislation, which is this November, will be 2 years old, was to compel every government agency. The province of BC said that it would align its policies, its laws, everything with the UN Declaration. So as when that Declaration Act was enacted in November 2019, immediately I called together our advisory to say, okay, let's look at the repatriation policy, let's look at our collection policy, and immediately what we saw is we're going to need to find a way to properly commission artists for their work, and not this, you know, do you want to donate it? If private donors want to donate, that's one thing. But if we're asking artists to replace for the purpose of exchanging, we're going to have to commission them for those pieces. So we're going to have to do some fundraising over the next few years to do that well. And I'm a really big advocate of that. I don't let, I'm always lecturing artists about, don't let everyone keep asking you for donations. You can sell it to them wholesale and they'll still make money off of it. So it's nice to be nice, but you have to put food on your table too.
Thank you.
I think Amar had a question. Maybe it's been answered somehow, but Amar.
Oh, thanks.
Yes.
I just love listening to you talk, Luann. So it's all really interesting, exciting. I just, one comment and a question. I think I love the fact that you talk about there's more Indigenous capacity and roles and people filling in these shoes, you know, from curatorial to facilities and collections management. And I think it's exciting. I hope there's more Indigenous people in these positions, because that's the way change can happen. And they bring knowledge and they bring the values to these positions. And just as a question for you, I think, what do you see as the barriers to more of sort of getting out of this whole museums, collections, objects, you know, in a Western canon, sort of art historically speaking, model to more of a living culture and a more dynamic model? What do you think the barriers are, either institutionally or from the public perceptions? Or is it just, you know, funding is the biggest barrier to, you know, enabling, like you said, more of these objects being created or being shared?
That's great. Yeah, I think that, I think all of us have in the museum and across, and just citizens in general have to rethink what a museum really is. And that's been on my mind a lot lately. I think the biggest barrier is an attitudinal barrier. It's the fact that we've all been conditioned to think the museums are the places of where mummified things, dead things are stored and gazed at. And but I think that I used to actually run around this museum when I was a kid. So, so for me, I always considered all the pieces I was looking at from my culture as alive. I did not understand why they were behind glass. I did not understand why I couldn't touch them, because we had some at home. We have things at home. I touch them and dance around my living room sometimes just to keep practice. So I think the attitude has to be revisited and changed. I think we've been conditioned into believing that museums are one very singular idea, and really now there's a multitude of ideas, and I think they should be more referred to as places where our collective histories are shared. It's a place of history. It's a treasure box. In our language, we would have words that would describe it as a treasure box where things of importance are held and talked about. So I think we have to do that for one. And if we change our attitude to this is a place where living cultures, that people who are still here, who have these long histories and we don't have to fight over how long we've been here. We know how long we've been here. So that's what should be told. And the attitude of, because I'm the curator, I will tell your story. I don't even believe in that myself. I believe my role as a curator is to spend time with the communities and just offer whatever help I can to help tell their stories the way they want to tell them, because they're the ones who know. And so my role is really a facilitator of telling histories. So I know some curators in other places won't be happy with me saying that, but I think that's where we have to go. We have to change the attitudes, change the way we look at things, and then change our practice. And we're going to have to do that with the UN Declaration and with the declaration in BC. We're compelled to do that. So I'm in favor of that.
We've been, Leah and I have been talking about, and we promoted the handbook that you co-authored with your colleagues on repatriation, published through the BC Museum. And just going through it again this morning before this talk, and I was really struck by a quote of yours where you talk about actually coming to the museum as an artist in residence, and feeling the pieces, the poles, and the carvings for the first time. In that context, as you've just very clearly mentioned, it wasn't foreign to you growing up around them, and wondering why you can't touch them. So then finally, as this kind of elevated artist, being able to go behind the scenes and actually feel the depths of those cuts for the first time, and the knowledge that's held in those, cuts, or the different levels of engagement. Anyway, so I was really struck by that quote of yours, and made me think about, if you kind of keep pulling that thread or following that road, that the repatriation then really becomes about, and this kind of goes back to what Amar was saying, but it goes back to removing barriers to knowledge, and giving these pieces, these artworks back to the community is again allowing the knowledge to speak.
You know what? Just as you're saying that, it reminds me of I think the British Museum. All of us colonized people are always going, British Museum, we want to talk to you. And I just don't buy they have two arguments. Number one, we can't just give everything back because it's legislation. You can change legislation any day of the week. It takes a long time, but you can do it. It can be done. It got changed to get to where it's at now. So I don't buy that. And the second one is, but if these pieces weren't here, then nobody around the world would learn about these people's history. Well, yeah, they would. Yeah, they would. They'd go to the place where these people are. And so I don't buy that either. And especially what I just said about, the convention was that curators would be the ones who would tell these stories. But the communities need to tell these stories. The communities are the curators, and so I don't think it's appropriate for big museums, especially like the British Museum. We all know have our entire histories are sitting in their back rooms and haven't seen the light of day since they took it from our communities, and it's of no use to them. It's of no interest to them. Sometimes I mean, not sometimes, there's quite a bit of errors in their records. And it's same for this museum too. I'm not pointing fingers just at the British Museum, but many of our museums, for whatever reasons, sometimes pieces got donated and the donor didn't have any background info. So it wasn't clear where the piece came from or which nation it's even associated with. So we do have a lot of work to do to straighten that out. But to not find that information and then attempt to tell a story is, I think, only getting a chance to tell a portion of one perspective of one individual. So if we want it to be rich and really understand, the reason why we all tell these histories is so we can learn from them and make better futures for our grandchildren. So why would we not do that, want to do that? Rant, you political artist, you.
It's great. It's just information.
I was talking with somebody about there was lots of discussion about pieces going back to countries in Africa where just so much was taken away that the community was left with practically nothing. And that just breaks my heart, because it's the same story for many of our communities as well. We have communities who up until 20 years ago didn't even have songs. They had no more songs. And if you don't have songs, you don't have language, you don't have regalia, you don't have dancing, and that's what kills people. And we have to stop holding these things back from these communities. Thankfully, amongst the coastal communities here in BC especially, is there's a lot of singers that remember when I said people would be multilingual. Well, many of our singers would learn the songs of other nations so that they could support them. If there was only a couple of singers, they could join in and help them out as well. So fortunately, several of our singers who've been in this practice for several decades were able to remember songs and bring them back and give them back to the communities and teach some of their young people. One of our composers was just up in one of our remote villages for the last couple of weeks doing just that, bringing songs home. And some of them come from museum collections. We're digitizing all the audio collections so that we can, pop them online, they can download them and start learning them again. I've witnessed songs coming back that haven't been heard in over 100 years, coming back to a community thanks to the work of our amazing singers and composers. And it took all the elders to remember, what's the regalia that goes with the dance? What's the dance in the first place? Who has the rights to these things? So we have to do all this untangling or additional research to put things back together, just so that they can be part of our living culture again. Any other questions? I might not. Oh yes, our songs would fill your heart. They are amazing. You can actually see if you type in. There's so many ways that our tribal names have been spelt, but if you type in Indigenous songs of BC in Google, you'll probably find a whole bunch on YouTube. Some of our young people have been given permission to share parts of our ceremonies to educate the public again. So yeah, I love our songs. I was listening to some on my way on my drive yesterday, and I thought, oh, I better not play this too loud through everyone else's territory. But yes, this is what energizes me.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm reminded too of the role that the museum played just in storing whatever the term was for those very old records, the audio recordings that Jeremy Dutcher used in his multi-award-winning album that just came out.
Oh, the wax cylinders.
The wax cylinders.
Wax cylinders. Yeah, that's just amazing.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think that I think we're going to be sort of turning a corner on the discussion around traditional versus contemporary. I love that discussion because my great grandfather, Charlie James Yakutlas, was through our family oral history. My aunties and uncles would say, great grandfather used to talk to mom, my grandmother, about every piece he created was contemporary.
Mhm.
Because in his era, it was, I'm in the here and now, I'm creating a piece, it's contemporary. Traditional was just something that was created by the generations before, and that was the distinction. But it doesn't seem to be filtering into the art world that way. And sometimes that really ghettoizes us into having to characterize our pieces and do artist statements that talk about how traditional it is. And it's like, how come we're not allowed to just be artists right here in the here and now? This is why a lot of my work is really I love playing with abstract and cubism, and cubism was my favorite in art school. But I love playing with that because that's what I learned from my grandmother's work. Is these are the elements, these are the teachings, this is the practice, this is the discipline. Your creativity is to do something different. You want you to carry on what we've always done, share it with the nieces, nephews, and the children. But what imprint are you going to leave? And so I really love that way she used to look at the world. And she was also a really big advocate for our arts and regarding our arts as not some traditional historic thing. That's, I think, in her 1948 keynote speech at the arts conference, she said something to the effect of, if our culture is a dead culture, then it's just fit to be mummified and placed in museums. And how interesting that she should talk about museums, and then I end up at a museum. So yeah, we have a lot, I think, just a lot of thinking to do around this. And I think there's really new vocabulary emerging around this as well. And I think we should embrace that, because we can't use colonial terms to describe how we're going to decolonize something. That's just
That's another thing that needs to be released.
let it go.
I'm reminded of someone, it was like a pop star said, "Oh, how do you define pop music?" And he just said, "Well, it's on the radio, isn't it? Like, it's happening right now, and it's popular within this time that we're in, and that's pop music. Like, it can't be not popular if it's on the radio," sort of thing. And so just your comment about traditional versus contemporary, or how there's a continuum, but definitely that you are a contemporary artist, I think really resonates.
Yes. Yeah, we talk, we chat about it amongst ourselves, our artists, when we get together for just collaboration sessions or just getting into the same space and doing work together. And people, and everyone says, why are we even having this discussion? We're artists, we're creating art, full stop. That isn't that enough? And why do we have to dice it up into all these little categories, and you have to decide which medium you're in? And I said, yeah, that's why I just play with everything. I love, the jewelry, the painting, the textiles, the carving. And so I'm still learning how to carve too. But yeah, I don't like the idea of being limited. When I went to art school and they wanted me to declare what I was doing, I said, I came here to learn your ways. And then I'm going to do an exhibit called Me Watching You Watching Me. And it's an exhibit about me watching people look at our stuff in museums and gazing upon us and wondering what interesting things are these people thinking about when they look at our things. But yeah, there's again, the vocabulary. I think we should embrace the idea that that's going to expand, and don't get stuck on old terminology and old beliefs. A lot of the old beliefs that we have in general in Western society are formed on these colonial narratives that were absolutely constructed to create some kind of a effect. And the effect has been on our people that, people think we're primitive. I always hear, and you see it on Twitter, especially, oh, you people were running around with loinskins before we came along and built roads and made you civilized. And I think, wow, that's quite a narrative you've picked up there, and very ill-informed or not informed at all. So, just getting people to a new place, and really re-educating almost the whole population and taking away the rhetoric and the propaganda that was placed and the demonizing of our people, and therefore the primitivizing of our work. You know, they're back in past, they're gone now. That's why their stuff's in the museum, and they were savages. And so that narrative has to go. We know it's not true. I know it's not true. Yeah, and we all have to work on that, though, and be willing to work on that.
On that note, how would you change the word museum? Because I think, again, just coming back to like using the same words to decolonize ourselves. You know, I mean, the idea of a museum, again, is a house of wonder coming from like the Germans and then the British as well, and just a storehouse, essentially, really is what it was for collecting curiosities. You know, when you go back into time, and with the whole sort of colonizing mandate and all these objects and artifacts that were just being without any context, without any understanding. So yeah, maybe I think maybe you start with, how do we change the word museum? What's the new word for a museum?
Oh, I wish I had that today, but I think we are going to see a really big discussion on that over time. We actually have the BC Museums Association conference coming up in early October. And I'm going to be part of a repatriation panel talking. And I hope I have a couple of at least initial thought bubbles on what do we call. But I have been thinking about that lately. Why the word museum? Can we not change it? We're here now. We're in the, you know, these territories. What should we be calling these places, and how should we regard them? And they're not just, I don't think, we can't think of them as a place for gathering curiosities and oddities, because just that thinking alone centers, it's a Eurocentric way of looking. It's just like saying people don't think about the word inclusion. Inclusion means someone's at the center and they're going to include you. I had this discussion last week with my colleagues on a policy matter, and they were very happy about their words inclusion. I said, I don't want to be included in your game. I want you to come and see where I'm coming from, and then we'll all, you know, we shouldn't have to be looking to include after the fact. We should be consulting in the first place. So I'm not sure about the word or the words that will recharacterize what museums are. Somewhere in there, to me, it's about all of our collective histories, and I would just love to see more exhibits. Wherever these museum spaces are, these history places are, that they're talking about the interaction of cultures. You know, we've got all these great interactions between First Nations, you know, prior to contact in the first place. We had all these trade routes and relationships, and then the point of contact and those different experiences, and even the space where the Royal BC Museum is in downtown Victoria near the harbor. That's a very specific space that was used by the local nations for harvesting. So why was we never told that story?
Exactly. I think you know, as these storehouses and galleries and museums continue to decolonize, we're going to see a lot of fantastic new ways to refer to them. And two examples that are fresh in my memory right now is the Southern Alberta Art Gallery, which is a contemporary art gallery. I think they do have a collection perhaps, but their focus is very much on temporary exhibitions. Under the directorship of Christy Trenier, they changed their name to reflect the nation in which the gallery sits. And so they invited an elder in, and or maybe several elders, and discussed, you know, what happens here and how do we call this activity? And so, of course, it's a very, very long name that not a lot of white people can say yet. and that will change slowly over time. You know, the young kids, because it's a very active school program in that center. So those young kids are going to grow up thinking that that's exactly what it's called and what it's always been called. Yes. So that's, you know, one way. And then the newer gallery in Winnipeg, where I'm originally from, it's a gallery that focuses on Inuit art, and they've just built this, you know, brand new huge building, and they really took it to task that they couldn't just call it the Inuit Art Center, which is sort of what everyone was referring to it as, but it now has a proper name that refers to actually the way that light comes through. That's, if you kind of unpack the name, that's what the elders that they consulted said, well, this is what you should call it.
Right.
So, and, light being a kind of form of knowledge as well, things like that.
Yes.
So, yeah, so I think, this kind of idea of what to refer to museums with maybe one way is still wrapped up in that Eurocentric problem. So it's just it's being many, many ways depending on where the museum is or the storehouse is or the gallery is or whatever. And that would be great because we call them something the same for what, 400 years, 500 years,
yeah.
not very long.
We're due for a name change.
Exactly. Like these old institutions, these old systems, they're all due for a change. So
that's right. And I'll add one last point on that. I think that I'm really excited about what I see happening in our communities because there was a time when in Alert Bay, we have a cultural center. It's called the Umista Cultural Center. And Umista talks about the return of something that's been taken away. Like in times of war, people would be taken away and we would pay a ransom to get them back. So the Umista talks about them coming back. And this was the case with our treasures. We had to pay a very dear ransom to get them back. And one of the ransom or the requirements was that we had to build that cultural center. We had to build a museum. And then there was funding at the time to do that. And there was operating dollars for a few years. And then government yanked the operating dollars out from underneath everybody. And I know this affected all kinds of different organizations, Native and non-Native, but those cultural centers only had that money and they were required to do it. So, that colonial interference on that level needs to stop as well. And now, and when we talk about the repatriation at the museum, I always say to communities, you don't have to build a museum. It's none of our business what you do with your treasures when you get them home. It's just none of our business. Our business is to make sure that we follow your direction and we get them home safely. Or if you want to do something else, then we'll follow your lead on that. But if communities are going to be wanting to build something and spaces where they can do this, they know that they can know now that they do so because they want to. And so I'm always looking for funding that I can let communities know about if they're wanting to build a small community archive, or don't even call it that. If it's your community's resource center where you can learn and your children can learn about your history and your language, etc., call it whatever you want. And build it whichever way you want. If you want our advice about conservation and stuff like that and displaying, we'll happy to share whatever we have. But that it's not us imposing on communities what they should be doing. So I think that's a big step in the right direction. And out of that, I think our young people, who I'm so excited that they're so involved in our culture, I think they're really going to lead the way on new terminologies, new ways of looking at it, and just new practice. And they're going to take our conventional museum practices and evolve them in a really beautiful way.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. I think we've gone through all the questions in the chat. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. Really appreciate your time. Leah, did you have something to say? Just like you jump there.
I just want to thank you, Luan, for sharing and for I don't know, just bringing joy to this like virtual space. I feel we've been talking about very serious things, but that I've just loved your smile and your laughter and being in this joyful space while we discuss these serious topics. So thank you so much.
Ayla Kessler. Thank you. And I will come down and visit your new space. I was saying before we logged on, the last time I was at Art Council was when they were up on at the Sussex building, the old Sussex.
Oh yeah, it's been a while.
My hair was black then. That's how long it's been.
Thank you so much, Luan. It was an amazing session. I'm really blessed to attend this session and to learn more about your cultures.
Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Belgium.
Yes, wonderful. Great. Well, thanks.
And Amar, thank you also for being here this morning.
Yes, really appreciate everyone that showed up. And so we'll sign off, but like we mentioned, the video will be uploaded later today or tomorrow, so you can spread that around and send the link if you like. And I put the link to the handbook that's a downloadable PDF in the chat, so feel free to download that before it goes. And apart from that, just everyone have a safe weekend. And if you're fighting a fire, fight it well. And if you're not, then stay safe.
How do we do that? Yes. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. And don't let Friday the 13th get to you.
Yeah, lots of smile. Keep shining.
Thank you so
All right.
much. Take care.
Bye-bye.